There is a moment many men never name out loud, a moment when you look at yourself, bending, smoothing edges, lowering your tone, explaining your intentions in careful, almost ceremonial detail, and you realize you have reshaped yourself entirely around someone who treats you as if you are an extra in a myth where only they matter. You've performed the moral contortions you were taught would earn respect: patience, steadiness, reliability, the willingness to carry more than your share. And yet somehow, the more you offer, the more invisible you become. One of the most common unconscious mistakes men make here is assuming that their goodness was misread, when in reality, it was reinterpreted as compliance. Picture this clearly. A man standing in a kitchen after another argument, not shouting, not slamming doors, just trying to stabilize the chaos. He thinks this calmness is strength. He believes it should earn appreciation. Instead, he watches their eyes glaze over as if he is predictable, safe to ignore, easy to replace. There is a quiet humiliation in that moment, one that most men swallow because it seems unmanly to admit. But the truth is far more structural than personal. In the world of a narcissist, respect is not a mutual exchange. It's a hierarchy, not an acknowledgement of character, but a ranking system based on who holds emotional dominance. What makes this so disorienting is the ritual-like dynamic that forms around them. Being with a narcissist resembles entering an arena where only one person is allowed a weapon. You walk in unarmed because you believe relationships thrive on transparency and goodwill. But the moment you notice the imbalance, the moment you subtly tense or pull back, you're treated as though you violated an unspoken right. And here again, the unconscious interpretation many men make is, if I stay patient, if I stay soft, they'll finally see me. Often, the opposite is true. This deeper wound rarely begins in adulthood. It's shaped earlier, in subtle childhood moments where love was tied to obedience, where approval was unpredictable, where the parent's mood, not your needs, set the tone of the household. Many men carry this quietly into adulthood without ever naming it. The belief that if you stay composed, agreeable, forgiving, you'll finally earn a place. Jung might say this is the archetype of the obedient son living inside the man, still negotiating worth through appeasement. But beneath him lies another figure, the muted king or warrior who senses the injustice but has been trained to treat self-assertion as treason. If you slow down enough, you can feel the clash between these two inner figures. One bows his head automatically. The other resents the bow but doesn't yet trust his right to stand tall. This tension creates the perfect vulnerability for a narcissist to exploit. They don't need to overpower you. They only need you to doubt the legitimacy of your own boundaries. That doubt becomes the architecture of the trauma bond itself. Devaluation punctuated by tiny drops of affection that feel like relief. And because the relief is rare, it lands as significance. From the outside, this looks irrational. From the inside, it feels like destiny. The nervous system plays its part. Chronic stress paired with intermittent comfort creates an addictive loop. Your body starts to interpret instability as intimacy, unpredictability as chemistry. Peace feels unfamiliar, even unsafe. And the mistake many men make is blaming themselves for not being stronger, when the real issue is neurobiological conditioning layered on top of emotional imprinting. So we arrive at the central question, the one that quietly haunts anyone who has tried to earn respect within an unbalanced dynamic. If loyalty, kindness, steadiness, and sacrifice are dismissed or exploited, what is the one force a narcissist cannot ignore when a man finally inhabits it? We'll get there, steadily and without dramatics. But if you stay with me, especially through the midpoint, you'll see the pivot men often overlook, the shift that doesn't plead for respect, but rewrites the entire relational equation from the inside out. Before we move on, one optional micro-practice. If you want to test your awareness, take a single breath and notice what part of your body tightened while listening. Was it the chest, the jaw, the stomach? Often the place that tightens first is the place your obedient son learned to hold everything in. You're not trying to change anything, just noticing the cost of years spent being good. When you're ready, we'll step into the first layer of the trap, what it really means when respect slowly becomes your disappearance. There comes a point in certain relationships when you start to notice something quiet but disorienting. The more you soften your tone, The more you explain your intentions, the more you show patience, the more the other person seems to shrink your presence rather than meet it. It is here that many men misinterpret the experience. They assume they are failing to communicate well enough, or not being calm enough, or not loving enough, when in reality the dynamic is built on a different definition of respect entirely, one where your interior life is expected to dissolve in order to preserve someone else's dominance. For many men, this pattern doesn't feel foreign, it feels familiar. Some part of you learned long ago that silence equals safety, that having no needs, no dissent, no friction was the way to stay connected. This conditioning can be so subtle that you don't even label it as self-erasure. You simply call it being steady, patient, reasonable. Jung might say that the obedient son fragment steps forward here, the part of you that learned to earn approval not by existing fully, but by compressing yourself. To someone with narcissistic patterns, this fragment is ideal. They are not looking for a partner, they are looking for psychic vacancy, a person whose self-doubt can be shaped into compliance. If you listen closely to your own behavior, you may notice how often you rush to explain yourself, clarify your tone, or soften a boundary that wasn't even harsh to begin with. These reflexes aren't signs of weakness. They are signs of habituated subordination. They reveal how thoroughly you internalize the belief that harmony requires your disappearance. And here is the first quiet reframing to let settle in your chest. What if the respect you keep trying to earn is actually a request for self-erasure? When you allow that question to breathe, the atmosphere around the relationship becomes easier to see. Because beneath the surface, their insistence on respect is rarely about mutual regard. It's often a shield for something they cannot face within themselves. People who fear exposure, who are terrified of humiliation or accountability, use the language of respect as armor. If any disagreement, any boundary, any request for reciprocity can be reframed as disrespect, then your reality becomes easier for them to control. In dark psychology frameworks, this is the move that turns communication into obedience. And once you begin to decode it, the dynamic becomes unmistakable. They are not seeking to respect you. They are seeking confirmation of their superiority. There is a subtle moment when you begin to track the asymmetry between what they demand and what they offer. You notice the near total void on their side. You notice how requests from you become negotiation, while demands from them become law. And a second reframing emerges almost on its own. If respect is being used as a tool to choreograph your compliance, then the question is no longer, how do I make them see me? But, what emotional commodity are they protecting by shrinking me? This shift alone quietly recenters your agency. Because in many narcissistic environments, disrespect simply means you remembered you have autonomy. You express a preference, and it becomes an accusation. You recall a past event accurately, and it becomes insolence. You mention feeling hurt, and it becomes a threat. Men raised in volatile or authoritarian households often learned early that dissent equals danger, so the body reacts before the mind has time to interpret. The shoulders tense, the breath shortens, the voice softens. This isn't weakness, it's conditioning layered over years. And when equality feels destabilizing, it isn't because you lack strength. It's because your nervous system associates self-assertion with loss. Cultural expectations reinforce this as well. Traditions like respect your elders can, in distorted environments, become shields for abuse, rather than invitations to mutual dignity. Narcissists instinctively weaponize this residue, turning all relational friction into moral failure on your part. But once you see how the ritual works, something in you begins to question why your silence is the price of connection. If you're willing to reflect gently, one option you have is to notice a moment today when you felt the urge to explain yourself, even though nothing was at stake. Not to correct it, not to judge it, but simply to notice the old imprint reaching for approval. This kind of awareness begins to loosen the bond, not by confrontation, but by clarity. Because if respect has quietly become synonymous with your disappearance, then the next natural inquiry is inevitable. What happens when you stop participating in a ritual that was never designed to honor you? We'll move into that terrain next, slowly, without rush, and with enough space for your interior life to reappear. There is a moment, often quiet and strangely disorienting, when you begin to realize that the relationship has never been operating on the emotional logic you assumed. You may have believed that patience builds trust, that steadiness deepens connection, that showing up consistently communicates worth. Yet the responses you receive do not follow that rhythm. They follow something else entirely, an economy of scarcity where closeness is granted only when your absence becomes a threat. This is one of the illusions many men hold without noticing, the belief that loyalty automatically increases your value. In certain relational ecosystems, it does the opposite. To a narcissistic structure, people are not encountered as partners with inner worlds. They are encountered as sources. Validation, admiration, labor, attention, status, emotional stability, each becomes a form of supply. And supply is not appreciated, it is consumed. In this frame, the more available you are, the more abundant your supply seems, and the more replaceable you become. Scarcity, not devotion, is what temporarily elevates your position in their landscape. It has nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with their fear of losing access to what they extract from you. This is why you may notice that they behave or become unexpectedly attentive only when you begin to pull away, or when your tone becomes more opaque, or when another source enters their orbit. It isn't empathy, it's self-preservation. When you begin to see these patterns, another reframing slips into place. Your good intentions were never misread. They were repurposed into a resource. And your nervous system, loyal to its early conditioning, may have normalized this without question. Because the cycle that grips so many men is not psychological only. It is biological. Intermittent reinforcement forms the core of trauma bonding. When moments of affection or approval appear unpredictably, especially after periods of tension or criticism, the brain begins to clutch at them with disproportionate force. The cortisol of conflict, followed by the dopamine of relief, becomes its own chemical tether. Intimacy begins to feel indistinguishable from volatility. Deprivation amplifies the impact of crumbs, until those crumbs feel like feasts. This is why the occasional gentleness of a narcissistic partner can land with such intensity. It is not because the connection is deeper than you realized. It is because scarcity has exaggerated the emotional contrast. If kindness feels euphoric rather than steady, that is often a cue that your nervous system has been conditioned by unpredictability. Nothing is wrong with you. You are not naive or weak. You are responding to a pattern that has been studied, observed, and mapped in countless survivors. When the body is starved for safety, even momentary warmth can feel like oxygen. Here, another quiet challenge emerges, not as blame, but as clarity. If the highs feel spiritual and the lows feel annihilating, it may not be love that keeps you there. It may be the absence of stable attachment earlier in life, creating a magnet for familiarity. People raised in environments where affection was conditional or inconsistent often bond not through peace, but through intensity. They mistake emotional turbulence for meaning, because the body learned to associate unpredictability with importance. And then comes the deeper layer. Trauma bonds often disguise themselves as loyalty. You stay because you believe endurance proves character. You stay because conditional love trained you to believe that if you are patient enough, selfless enough, forgiving enough, the other person will eventually meet you. But a narcissistic system interprets loyalty differently. It does not translate loyalty as devotion. It translates it as low risk. If you are unlikely to leave, their incentive to treat you well decreases. Tolerance becomes permission. You may notice their violations escalating, the comments sharper, the dismissals more blatant, the double standards more unapologetic. Not because they are growing more hostile, but because the relational cost has disappeared. When someone knows your threshold does not move, they stop pretending to care where it sits. One optional way to observe this without changing anything yet is to track your emotional responses during the next moment of praise or affection. Does it feel grounding or intoxicating? Does it settle your body or spike it? This simple noticing often reveals how deeply the bond has been wired into your physiology. Because once tolerance becomes permission, a different question arises, one that cannot be avoided. What happens when the pattern is interrupted by something stronger than conditioning? That is where we are heading next, to the quiet but decisive turning point, where a man becomes unreadable, and the entire architecture of the bond begins to shift. There is a shift that happens not with shouting, not with ultimatums, not with emotional displays, but with something far quieter and far more disruptive. It begins the moment you stop narrating your inner world to someone who has never handled it with care. You may still be present, still courteous, still engaged in the surface-level rhythms of daily life, but your emotional transparency starts to retreat back to where it belongs, inside your own stewardship. Many men assume that the path to being understood is making themselves more legible. Yet in dynamics shaped by narcissistic patterns, legibility becomes a blueprint for manipulation. Being fully seen becomes a liability. When someone is used to reading your empathy, your guilt, your patience, and your conflict avoidance like instruments on a dashboard, they begin to predict you. They know when to push, when to withdraw affection, when to suddenly offer softness, when to weaponize silence. Predictive control is not always conscious, but it is structurally real. And the moment you stop signaling your emotional state, the map they rely on begins to blur. Jung might frame this as the warrior archetype emerging, not the warrior who attacks, but the one who guards the inner citadel by limiting access rather than escalating force. This is where a subtle reframing can feel almost unsettling. Your speeches don't recalibrate the power dynamic. Your reasoning doesn't restore balance. Your compassion doesn't inspire reciprocity, but your opacity, calm, unforced, grounded, interrupts the ritual. In a system that depends on your emotional exposure, the absence of legibility becomes a quiet rebellion. It shifts the gravitational field of the relationship without saying a word. You may notice almost immediately that volatility spikes, not because you have done anything wrong, but because their predictive control has been disrupted. Rage may surface, mocking may surface, guilt bait may surface, or just as often, sudden benevolence may appear. These reactions are not about you. They are the system scrambling to regain a forecast. When supply becomes unpredictable, attempts to reassert influence intensify. This is not a commentary on your worth, but on how deeply they relied on your emotional visibility. And here comes a sentence that many men find confronting but clarifying. Your silence is not hostility. Your privacy is not punishment. Your opacity is not cruelty. It is simply the end of self-abandonment. This can be difficult to accept when your earliest lessons taught you that love requires exposure, transparency, and immediate responsiveness. But those lessons came from environments where your boundaries were not protected. When you become opaque, you are not hardening. You are becoming responsible for yourself. Within this shift, an experiment sometimes emerges naturally. You enforce one small boundary without justification. You say no without softening the edges. You decline a request without bending over backward to explain your decision. Not as strategy, not as performance, but as a structural fact. The boundary stands for 24 hours, and in that brief window, something unexpected happens. You witness not only their reaction, but your own. You feel the familiar surge of fear that you will be punished, abandoned, misunderstood. This fear is not evidence that the boundary is wrong. It is evidence that your body was trained to believe that selfhood is dangerous. The experiment reveals more than the other person's response. It reveals the depth of your conditioning. Your reflexes, your tension, your self-questioning are often remnants of early dynamics rather than reflections of present truth. And yet, observing these reactions without collapsing into them becomes a turning point. You begin to understand that autonomy does not destroy connection. It merely exposes which connections require your submission to survive. As the hours pass, you may notice patterns in their response: ignoring, mocking, escalating, suddenly flattering, or offering selective vulnerability. Each of these is less about emotion and more about testing your pliability. If the old version of you resurfaces, they regain the map. If the new opacity remains, the map continues to dissolve. This is why the midpoint of this journey is not loud. It is not cinematic. It is simply a man choosing to remain himself in the presence of someone who prefers him confused. And as we move forward, this clarity sets the stage for something deeper. Because once predictive control breaks, the next phase becomes unmistakable. How an actual shift in power emerges when a man stops performing and begins to live from a different internal order. There is a point in many men's lives where the pattern becomes undeniable. You find yourself doing everything right, showing competence, carrying crises, predicting needs before they're spoken, stabilizing storms before they form. And instead of earning steadiness or mutuality, you become the structure the other person leans on without ever acknowledging its weight. This is not a failure of masculinity. It is the predictable outcome of a dynamic where your strength is treated as a resource to be harvested, rather than a presence to be honored. And one of the illusions many men hold here is believing that indispensability will eventually translate into respect. Imagine a man. We'll call him J. He excels at work, mediates conflict, keeps the household running, absorbs emotional turbulence without projection. In public, he is praised for being the calm center of everyone else's chaos. In private, he is demeaned, belittled, or blamed the moment he falters. This contrast becomes the quiet wound he carries. The origin of that wound traces back to a father who only valued exceptional achievement, who rewarded usefulness more than existence. Without realizing it, Jay internalized a belief that being needed is the closest thing to being loved. So he leans deeper into that pattern. He works harder. He becomes more reliable, more available, more self-sacrificial, convinced that this will finally shift how he is seen. But in narcissistic structures, the opposite occurs. The more he gives, the more his efforts are taken as baseline expectation. The more he stabilizes, the more instability becomes normalized. Every compliment he receives begins to feel transactional. Every request he responds to contains an unseen surcharge. Slowly, he becomes the golden child of the relationship, a role he never asked for, a role that demands constant performance and provides no refuge. The turning point begins not with an explosion, but with exhaustion that finally becomes honest. One day, Jay notices that he is the only one doing the emotional labor of keeping the relationship functional. Something in him quietly withdraws, not as protest, but as clarity. He stops equating sacrifice with worth. He stops using depletion as proof of devotion. This isn't rebellion, it's awakening. Jung might say he has stopped identifying with the hero archetype, the one who earns belonging through suffering, and has begun to inhabit the king archetype, the one who governs his energy with sovereignty rather than desperation. The shift is internal long before it becomes visible. Jay becomes less predictable. Not cold, not cruel, simply unwilling to prop up dynamics that drain him. And because narcissistic systems rely on predictability, the reaction is immediate. Ridicule appears, mocking comments framed as jokes, tests disguised as curiosity, subtle probing to see if his agency is temporary. You may recognize these behaviors: triangulation, sudden withholding of information, asking other people about him instead of asking directly. These aren't random. They signal that his withdrawal has complicated the calculus of control. Here is another reframing that quietly reorients everything. When you stop performing, people are forced to reveal whether they valued you or only valued what you provided. This is not meant to indict anyone. It is simply how relational systems expose themselves when the supply shifts. Eventually, the moment arrives that crystallizes the entire dynamic. In Jay's case, it was an unethical request, a small cover-up at work, a bending of truth that he had previously justified in order to preserve harmony. But this time, he doesn't negotiate. He doesn't explain. He simply refuses, calmly, as a fact of identity rather than a performance of strength. And because he no longer seeks approval, the usual tactics fail. Rage doesn't move him. Guilt slides off. Smear attempts lose power because he no longer anchors his self-worth to how he is perceived. And something unexpected happens. The person who once devalued him suddenly changes tone. The contempt softens. The derision pauses. Respect appears, not as admiration or remorse, but as strategic recalibration. Because a man willing to walk away is no longer predictable supply. His boundaries now have cost, and cost forces adjustment. But here is the truth many men don't realize until this moment. Jay doesn't stay to enjoy the newfound respect. By the time respect arrives, it no longer matters. His compass has shifted from trying to be chosen to choosing himself. His dignity is no longer outsourced. He has stopped performing for proximity. The relationship may end, or it may transform, but the axis of power has already moved within him. This case clarifies something most men feel but cannot articulate. Respect from a narcissistic structure does not emerge from goodness, sacrifice, or loyalty. It emerges only when those traits are no longer available to exploit. And by the time you inhabit that kind of self-respect, what they call respect becomes merely a faint echo of what you have already claimed internally. As we move forward, this understanding prepares the ground for the next revelation. When a man becomes a threshold rather than a resource, even the most predatory dynamics must recalculate their approach. There is a quiet transformation that happens after a man has stopped performing, stopped appeasing, stopped explaining himself into exhaustion. Something settles in him, not as defiance but as order. The frantic attempts to earn respect fall away, and what remains is a different orientation altogether, one where his actions flow from an internal structure rather than from someone else's volatility. Many men misunderstand this stage. They imagine it as distance or emotional shutdown. In truth, it is coherence. When your sense of worth no longer depends on the reactions of a wounded person, your nervous system begins to reorganize around stability rather than appeasement. In this clarity, you begin to see how much energy was previously spent trying to manage someone else's emotional weather. You begin to see the cost of bending yourself into the shape of their expectations. And more importantly, you begin to see that chasing respect was a kind of disguise, an attempt to negotiate safety instead of embodying it. Jung would say that individuation is not about becoming hardened, it is about becoming aligned. You stop outsourcing your center of gravity. You begin to live by an internal law rather than interpersonal approval. When this shift takes root, narcissistic dynamics respond in a predictable pattern. There are subtle tests, boundary microchecks, nostalgic messages, indirect pings through mutual acquaintances. Not gestures of connection, but probes. They are trying to see whether the version of you they once manipulated is still accessible. The old scripts appear. Are you still available on demand? Can you still be guilted or flattered into compliance? Will you still trade your peace for their temporary validation? But the difference now is internal. You answer from alignment, not from fear. Here, another reframing emerges that many men find both liberating and sobering. The goal is not to be intimidating. The goal is to be costly to violate. There is a distinction between fear-based influence and consequence-based presence. Machiavelli wrote about the tension between love and fear, but in this context, neither applies. You are not cultivating fear. You are embodying boundaries with weight. A man whose no has structure, whose values are non-negotiable, whose self-respect is lived rather than spoken, cannot be cheaply trespassed. This is not about dominance or retaliation. It is about integrity becoming a threshold. When you live from this place, other people adjust, not because you demand it, but because interacting with you carries natural consequences. In literature and myth, there is an archetype of the sovereign who commands space without raising his voice. Aragorn stepping forward, not seeking approval, not asserting superiority, but embodying a presence that makes manipulation ineffective. Even antagonists shift their strategies around such a figure because he is no longer predictable and no longer available for exploitation. And here is a sentence that often lands with a depth that surprises men. When you finally inhabit your own authority, their behavior tells you more about them than it ever again tells you about yourself. Respect from a narcissistic system at this point is not admiration. It is recognition of cost. They calculate differently because the ground beneath them has changed. You are no longer an emotional commodity. You are a threshold. If you want to feel this internally, you might notice a moment when you choose stillness instead of explanation, or a moment when you speak from your values rather than from the fear of someone's reaction. These moments, though small, create a kind of internal architecture. Over time, they become the lived structure of sovereignty, not inflated strength, not withdrawal, simply coherence. This clarity leads naturally to the final realization, the one force a narcissist cannot dismiss, and the one truth a man cannot pretend to embody. It is the culmination of everything we have explored, the shift from earning respect to becoming a man who does not abandon himself. That is where we will go next, to bring the journey full circle and name the force that recalibrates every dysfunctional dynamic at its roots. There is a moment, often quiet and unceremonious, when a man realizes he has spent years trying to earn something that cannot be granted from the outside. Respect that must be bargained for, negotiated, performed, or proven is not respect. It is dependency, dressed in ritual. And in relationships shaped by narcissistic patterns, every form of decency you offered was interpreted through the lens of control. Kindness became compliance. Loyalty became predictability. Steadiness became something to lean on without ever honoring the weight you carried. Yet none of these traits, no matter how noble, could compel genuine respect, because respect in that ecosystem is not relational. It is strategic. What shifts everything is not an argument or an insight, not a confrontation or an apology. It is the emergence of embodied self-respect, backed by consequence, not threats, not demonstrations, simply the quiet truth that you will not abandon yourself to keep a relationship intact. This is the one force a narcissistic system cannot dismiss, because it removes the very leverage the dynamic depends on. When you become willing to lose them rather than lose your integrity, the entire architecture changes. It is not about power over them. It is about power returned to yourself. As you look back over everything we've explored, you might see the progression with a clarity that was harder to grasp while living inside it. The journey begins with obedience mistaken for strength, moves through the recognition of an emotional economy built on extraction, continues through the unraveling of trauma bond conditioning, deepens at the moment you begin setting boundaries without justification, and culminates in the emergence of a sovereign internal order. Each step builds the gravity behind your no. Each step constructs a version of you that is no longer negotiable. And here, another reframing settles in. The respect you were chasing was never admiration. It was the hope that they would finally see your goodness. But what you call goodness, they call opportunity. Only when your selfhood becomes non-negotiable, when your boundaries become lived rather than spoken, do they recognize that violating you carries cost. Their recalibration is not love, it is strategy. Your victory is not their transformation, it is your autonomy. A single image can hold this truth more simply. Imagine a fortress carved from basalt. It does not shout, it does not persuade, it does not chase wandering sailors or storms. It remains itself. Some adjust their course around it, others crash against it. But its purpose has nothing to do with how others approach. Its integrity is its own quiet authority. When a man reaches this kind of internal solidity, he stops fearing who might leave, because he has finally stopped leaving himself. There is also something tender that deserves acknowledgement. The part of you that once begged for respect was never defective. It was a younger part, unprotected, shaped by inconsistent love and early experiences that taught you to negotiate for space rather than inhabit it. Adulthood offers a second chance, not to erase that younger version of you, but to become the guardian he never had. Shadow integration is not about eliminating weakness, it is about reclaiming the abandoned strength inside the wound. And the nervous system has its role here too. Recovery is not a moral challenge, it is a biological retraining. If chaos has felt like connection and unpredictability has felt like meaning, the body must learn safety again, slowly, consistently, with compassion. Stability is not a personality trait, it is a practiced regulation. When your system begins to recognize calm as familiar rather than foreign, you stop gravitating toward those who thrive in chaos. So the challenge, if there is one, is quiet. Growth is not measured by whose approval you win, but by the moment their reactions cease to anchor your decisions. When your compass no longer spins in response to someone else's disorder, self-respect becomes not an idea, but a lived posture. If any part of this resonated, there is an option available to you. You might take a moment and name, in one line, the moment you realized that what you called respect was actually self-betrayal, not as confession, not as performance, but as clarity. Your clarity may help another man recognize his own threshold.